समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
It's been a very long time since we talked about Ukraine. There is a war going on there. Also, because we've been so caught up, for good reasons, in what happened after Pahalgam. Pahalgam, its aftermath, which was Op Sindoor, and then what's been going on following that. Those are important things to talk about, and for us, the most important. However, it's now taken the Ukrainians something called Operation SpiderWeb to force our attention onto their country and their battlefield. And you know what's happened? What's happened is you remember that famous or infamous conversation. In fact, that was the last time we talked about Ukraine on Cut the Clutter, when Zelensky was upbraided on cameras to the whole world by J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. And when he was told, you have no cards, right? So he went back humiliated. He was told, you have no cards, and I wish I had used this line myself, but I will borrow it or steal it from Max Boot, the columnist at the Washington Post, who says Zelensky was told he has no cards. He has now played, and he says, pardon for using that pun, he has now played his Trump card. So this is an answer to Donald Trump as well. This is really using an incredible amount of ingenuity, with very low-level technology, very low-level cheap technology to hurt the third biggest military superpower in the world. I call Russia a military superpower. So third biggest military superpower, the largest nuclear weapon superpower in the world. And what's been hit is about one third of the aircraft, heavy bombers which are supposed to carry nuclear missiles for Russian Air Force. This is one of the three elements of the triad. As we know, for nuclear weapons, one is surface launched missiles. Second is what your submarines carry, which remains hidden at the bottom of the ocean. And third is what you can launch from the air. So this 120, 130 odd aircraft, of which maybe 80, 90 might be operational or serviceable at any given point of time, because many of these go back to a 1950s vintage. About one third of those have been taken out, it seems, in these strikes. So this is a very important event. You've seen it play out on your TV channels. It's been going on for more than 24 hours. So I'm not getting into that. However, what I will say is upfront that while we talk about this, it's not as if I will go away entirely from Op Sindoor. In fact, towards the later part of this episode of Cut the Clutter, I will talk about a very important aspect of Op Sindoor, which is what was the Indian Air Force doing in the 2 days between when they carried out the attacks on Bahawalpur and Muridke, the first night when they hit the terror bases, and the 9th night, 10th morning when they carried out that series of attacks on every single Pakistani air base east of the Indus River, east of the Indus system. So what was it doing over those 2 days? Some confusion has arisen that Chief of Defence Staff General Anil Chauhan gave on the sidelines of the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. So I will talk about some things which have remained unsaid so far and which need a little elaboration. The reason I'm linking this to today's episode is that the basic element on both is the same. That is drone warfare, because drones have now completely changed the battlefield. So as Max Boot says in Washington Post, Russians are calling it their Pearl Harbor moment. Pearl Harbor, as you know, December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacking waves of Japanese aircraft. Nobody thought they could fly that far through the Pacific, because that was also the power of the aircraft carrier. They came in they came in and destroyed the American Pacific Fleet. So far, the Americans were out of the war. What did they do? That changed the definition of the battlefield then. That destroyed the idea that the battleship was what mattered in the naval battlefield. Battleship gave way to the aircraft carrier to air power in a way. This is not very different from what happened in 1920s, 1930s. First World War finished, completely ended what was until then the strongest element in warfare, the cutting edge of warfare, which was horse cavalry, right? Horse cavalry was now open, machine gun came in, even more than the tanks, the machine gun came in. How do you launch horse cavalry in front of machine guns? You can deal with archers, right? With shields and things, but machine guns, no. That finished horse cavalry. Pearl Harbor ended the mystique of the battleship. Pearl Harbor ended the mystique of the battleship. And it looks like what's happened just now, in Russia, what the Ukrainians have done might raise question marks on the future, might raise a big question mark on the future of manned, expensive manned platforms, expensive manned aviation platforms, that is long distance bombers, that is super high tech fighter aircraft. How much can you achieve in how much cost while either risking a human life or risking having a human being or more than one human being taken prisoner? How much more can you achieve with these really cheap instruments of war? That is how drones have now completely redefined the battlefield. This is not an element in warfare now. Now, this is the leading element, like cavalry in the past, battleship, tank, just till the other day. This is now the defining weapon in the battlefield. Whoever has better drones uses them better, because it's not a question of what drones you have. It's also a question of how you use them. So ingenuity, presence of mind, and very young people can run these sitting 200 kilometers back. This is the new battlefield. That is the lesson now. I will tell you something that Roman Konstanko, chairman of Defense and Intelligence Committee of Ukrainian Parliament, said only this February. He said now 70%, 70% of all casualties in the war, in the Russia-Ukraine war, are being caused by drones. And you've seen at various points of time those pictures of 2 or 3 or 4 soldiers in a trench and the little drone coming for them, and the soldiers trying to run away, and the drone drops a little bomb, right? A $300 drone drops a bomb, 3, 4, 5 people are killed. It's become impossible. Trenches have now become a death trap in the Ukraine-Russia war. See how that war has progressed. In 2022 February, when I also blundered in saying that by the time you read this national interest, Russians will be in Kiev, right? I wrote on Friday, I thought by Saturday, by Sunday, they will be in Kiev, because they were on the outskirts of the Kiev. That didn't happen, because the Ukrainians used the Javelin missiles, just human beings, just infantry soldiers, because the Russians had come in without infantry. They were so sure of rolling over the Ukrainians that they did not secure their flanks. So these bands of 3, 4, 5 Ukrainian soldiers with man-portable Javelin missiles, they came in and they took out a lot of the tanks. And what happens if you have a row of tanks? If you have tanks and armored vehicles in one row, you take out one and you take out 20 vehicles back, then the others get stuck in the middle. So the crew panic, right? Either they run away or they don't know what to do, and you can pick them out one by one. The next phase, this was the first phase, and that is something that Donald Trump also spoke about when Zelensky went to White House, that if I had not given you those javelins, you would not have been able to fight the Russians. By the way, India has also bought a small amount of javelins from the Americans under the chief's discretionary emergency purchase quota, just a couple of thousand or thereabouts. That said, the next phase came very quickly. So while these javelins were playing a role, Russians still had enough armor to push into many areas, and that's when the Ukrainians brought in the Turkish-made Bayraktar drones. Now, Bayraktars can fly for 24 hours. They can go up to 25,000 feet. They are very expensive. They carry anti-tank missiles. They can carry anti-radiation missiles. They are like mini aircraft without pilots. So that's why they are expensive also. But sometime Bayraktars played their role, and we knew the ability of the Bayraktar because Azerbaijanis had used this against Armenia in the Nagorno-Karabakh battle. That the Russians got used to again in the course of time, because because this is a cat and mouse game. After a while, the Russians figured out what to do with Bayraktars. They started taking them down. They used air power, they used their missiles. They were also large enough and slow enough to be tracked and thereby neutralized. So that phase of warfare ended. That led to trench warfare and heavy artillery duels, right? That's when I might have said at one point of time that in modern warfare, the largest number of casualties are inflicted by artillery. That's been the truth for the past 30, 40 years. And that was the truth also in the Ukrainian battlefield until about a year ago. Until you know what happened? Russians had a preponderance of artillery, and yet they were running short of ammunition because they were firing so much. Then they started buying ammunition from Iran, they started buying enormous amounts of ammunition from North Korea, and thereby they were able to maintain a certain rate of fire. Ukrainians, in spite of all the help they got from the Europeans because the Americans were not able to produce so much, they were firing about one third, if not less than one third, of the 155 shells that the Russians were firing in the battlefield. So quantity in that case had begun to pulverize Ukraine's defensive lines. That's when Ukraine shifted to these small drones used in large numbers. And these drones, larger drones, would identify where the Russian artillery was positioned, and smaller drones will then carry out attacks and take out that Russian artillery. Since then, and Russians have followed the Ukrainians. The important thing is there are two important things here. One, that the Ukrainians have always led this innovation because the side that is more desperate usually innovates. If Ukrainians also had 20,000 155 shells a day, like the Russians might have had, maybe they would not have innovated. But because they had less than one third, they found these ideas. The second important thing is that Russians have been very quick to follow up on these ideas. So whatever the Ukrainians have done, the Russians have followed up. Russians haven't come up with that much innovation because they are the dominant power. So for a dominant power, it's tougher. You think, look, I have so many of these Iskander missiles. I have so many of these hypersonic missiles. I can obliterate them, right? I can fire these at them from 200 kilometers, 400 kilometers away from the range of their missiles. So you have all of that. You have less incentive for innovation. In fact, even if you see the success that the Russians have had with their drones, a lot of those drones they bought from a relatively low-tech country like Iran. So Shahed drones, which are kamikaze drones that the Russians use, have been bought from Iran, and Iran is mass producing them. They are not very accurate. They have range, they are not very accurate, but they can create a lot of nuisance because they pack 50, 60 kilos of explosives. So wherever they go, even if you shoot down 95% of them, which is possible for the Ukrainians, even if 5% get in, they will cause a lot of damage, and also they cause harassment of troops, of civilian areas, and also your vital points. So Russians are learning from Iranians. See how this equation has got completely twisted in the sense that the country which is so high-tech, which makes the second most high-tech weapons in the world. In some areas, in fact, they may make more high-tech weapons than even the US. For ages, Russia or Soviet Union has made quieter submarines than the US, for example. And they make their equipment much cheaper and at a much larger scale. They also have had to follow in the footsteps of their much weaker and smaller neighbor and then take help from another slightly distant neighbor, Iran, which really is not a country which is known for its technology or ingenuity, except maybe when it comes to enriching uranium and playing the game of squeeze play with the Americans on enriching uranium. I'll enrich this much more, and then I'll make a deal with you. This much more, I'll make a deal with you. Then I will stop it, like that. But beyond that, Iranians haven't produced very much. However, this one skill that they have, Shahed drones, that's come so handy for the Russians. That is how this war has become more or less a drone war now. Both sides are hitting each other with drones. In fact, even on the night before, night preceding Operation SpiderWeb, Russians had launched 472 drones on Ukraine of various kinds. See, these were bigger drones. Ukrainians claim that almost all of these were shot down, and about 18 missiles. They claim almost all, but about 5 missiles got through and some drones got through, and we've seen pictures of the damage that these caused. However, once again, the main instrument that delivers the punishment of war on either side is now these drones, and that's the big change. A little bit about Spider's Web and Ukrainian drones, and then I will come to what the Indian Air Force was doing on the 2 days between the day of the strikes at Bahawalpur and Muridke, and then those pulverizing strikes over the Pakistani air bases. The entire range of Pakistani air bases, radar stations, command centers from the north to the south of Pakistan, through the entire length of Pakistan. Operation Spider's Web was planned by SBU, which is Security Service of Ukraine. Ukrainian name is Sluzba Bezpeki Ukraini, which is SBU or Security Service of Ukraine. They had been planning it for 1.5 years. Details of this have been given out by Zelensky himself in a couple of Twitter threads, in which he's also said that this is a signal to Putin that he should negotiate, he should accept an immediate unconditional ceasefire for which Ukraine is ready, and negotiate, because otherwise he will suffer losses. It's not as if he can go on fighting this war at no cost to himself. That's the point that Ukraine is trying to make to Russia, or Zelensky is trying to make to Putin. Now, the basis that Ukrainians confirmed they've hit, and where we've seen aircraft burning, these pictures have come out because the drones are there. They are also taking those pictures, and evidence is there. Plus, in many cases, people outside the bases are also taking pictures and releasing them. We saw this happening from Pakistan on the night that Noor Khan base was hit. Other bases were hit. People were posting pictures from outside. Even in India, we saw that missile coming on top of Sirsa, being hit by an Indian missile, intercepted. That entire sequence was recorded by simple people on their phone cameras, and that's how we have the evidence that Pakistan fired that missile at around 12:45 a.m. Indian time. So it's complete rubbish of them to say that India started attacking us first and we thought we will unleash Bunyan al-Marsus after 4:30 a.m. after the Fajr prayer. They had started 4.5 hours before that. Right now, the Russian bases from which we've seen pictures of these strikes and burning planes, Belaya is in Siberia, 5,500 kilometers away. Now, if you're riding a truck, a highway truck, you can be going anywhere. Somebody tells a truck company, I want this cargo delivered in such and such place. They'll keep driving and get there. They don't know what the cargo is. Base called Olenia, that's in Murmansk. Murmansk is right northwest. So just as Siberia is far in the east, right? Murmansk is extreme northwest. See where Murmansk is? That is where also a lot of the Russian Arctic fleet is located. Russian nuclear submarines also around that area. It's next to Norway. Diaghilevo is 200 kilometers southeast of Moscow, and just to leave no doubt in the minds of the Muscovites that Ukrainians can hit anywhere, Diaghilevo is 200 kilometers southeast of Moscow. Ivanovo is 300 kilometers northeast of Moscow. So we are here and we are also there. Then the Russians say that they try to hit more air bases, including the Amur air base, which is far away on the border, somewhere on the border of China, near Mongolia, I suppose. In fact, it's after Amur that the Amur Falcon is named. And you know that famous Amur Falcon who's just gone flying 17,000 kilometers back home, somewhere there. There they say they were able to block these attacks. The story on the Falcon's journey, Falcons called, by the way, Chiluan 2, that's been reported by Akanksha Mishra from our science team. I will share a link with you. You can also see the screenshot on your screens as well. Now, that said, look at some of the broader categories of drones that Ukrainians have. So there is the vampire drones. These are Russians call them Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga, by the way, is not a male character. It's a female character, a Slavic female character who comes in mortar and pestle like silbata, right? Or the things in which you grind masala. At least my mom did. So Baba Yaga is a mythical Slavic character which comes and grinds you like this, right? which comes with the mortar and pestle. So the Russians have given these vampire drones, Ukrainian vampire drones, that name because they are like mythical things that come and grind you. They can travel up to 10 kilometers and carry 15 kilos of anything. These can be supplies, these can be medicines, these can be ammunition, these can be explosives, or these can be mines. And can you imagine a drone goes somewhere and lays hundreds of these tiny mines, right? Or a few drones go and drop hundreds of these tiny mines, or butterfly mines as those are called, or a little bit of some version of the cluster ammunition. This really harasses the daylights out of any sizable body of troops. So that is one. This drone can also go some distance and release smaller drones. So the thing about the drone business is that they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the smallest drone may also carry a couple of kilos of explosive, even one hand grenade, and that's enough to cause havoc. Then you have Dragon Breath. Dragon Breath is again an interesting innovation. Again, the Ukrainians started it. Everything Ukrainians started and Russians have followed. So they've got even on everything. Why is it called Dragon's Breath? Because if you see the Ukrainian-Russian landscape, this is flat. It's mostly flat. There are no hills. There are very few river courses. So the classical hide and seek country is not available there. No heights, no mountains, no multiple river streams, etc. So the only place where troops or bodies of troops have to hide is tree lines, right? So troops tend to sit under tree lines, so they are protected from drones. So these drones called Dragon's Breath, and you know why they're called Dragon's Breath, they go up there and they spray something called thermite. Thermite is a combination of finely powdered aluminum and iron oxide. That's the kind of stuff you use for welding and welding operations. So when it mixes, it releases extreme temperatures, and what that does is it burns the tops of the trees. So trees get denuded of their foliage. As the trees get denuded of their foliage, anything that's under the trees, anything that's hiding under the trees, that gets exposed. Once again, the Ukrainians started it, and then the Russians also started doing it. And that's the reason this war is now extracting very high casualties. That's something that Donald Trump also keeps talking about. The next category is drone versus drone. Ukrainians started this first. They started sending out the drones to fight Russian drones. They've used these drones, in fact, also to bring down 2 Russian combat helicopters, because a combat helicopter going very fast cannot see a tiny thing, a mosquito or a fly or a wasp coming from the side. But these drones have machine guns, right? These drones have machine guns or assault rifles. The only limitation is that they can only fire one magazine, because obviously another drone will not come and reload that magazine. So it can fire one magazine, but it can have a helicopter in its gun sights or in its range. That's a very bad death for the helicopter, and that really scares helicopter pilots, and that's what has brought down Russian attack helicopter operations in this region. Then you have a range of drones called Leleka. These are longer range drones. They can do a 100-kilometer round trip, and they can both record what they're watching and also live stream it, right? So operators in the back can decide what to do. These are very important for directing artillery fire. Then you have the Queen of Hornets. Queen of Hornets are quadcopters, which either are like pure kamikaze drones, which means they have explosives strapped onto them and they go and strike the target, or they can drop the explosive as well. They can use grenades. They are artificial intelligence controlled. They can also carry those rifles with single magazine. And innovation in this case is not just, I told you, a lot of the innovation is actually low tech. Ingenuity is in the mind, right? That is of a very high order. But a lot of the technology is low tech. So Ukrainians are now using biker squads, which means two soldiers ride really fast on their bikes, because ride so fast that before the Russian drones can catch them, they reach a place, they delivered what they have to deliver. Often it's ammunition, it can be medicine, it can be a message, whatever, and come back. So one drives, the other carries a weapon. So this is really one drives and the other rides shotgun. One rides, the other rides shotgun. I don't know if you've seen that film, but if you have, you will remember Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Harrison Ford riding the bike and Sean Connery in the sidecar, right, riding shotgun. So that is how these bikers also operate. That is as low tech can be. That's like going back to the First World War. But this long war, 3.5-year-old war, has brought in all this ingenuity in the battlefield. All of this, however, is extracting a great toll in terms of lives, Russian as well as Ukrainian. This done, I come back to what happened on the 2 days when it looked like Indian Air Force wasn't active. Because after CDS General Anil Chauhan said that there were losses that IAF suffered on the night of 6th and 7th May, we reviewed why the losses took place, and once that was sorted, Indian Air Force went back in attack. That is on the night of 9th and through the day on the 10th. And that is when 17 Pakistani air bases were hit. There are satellite pictures available from 11 of substantive damage from 11. Now, has this occurred to you that while all of this was going on, first of all, remember that Pakistan Air Force said, the Pakistan DGISPR said that all these missiles were air launched. They did not say these were ground launched missiles, which means whatever these missiles were, they were BrahMos or Scalp or Hammer or Crystal Maze, whatever these missiles were, they were launched by Indian Air Force aircraft. When Indian Air Force aircraft were launching these missiles over a 12 to 16 hour period, how come none of the Pakistan Air Force aircraft rose to challenge them? If they were so hot that on the night of 6th and 7th they could inflict damage on the Indian side, how come they did not even rise in challenge? In fact, there is no evidence anywhere that they challenged these Indian aircraft that were firing these smart weapons at their most wanted air bases, at the most critical targets. What happened? What happens? Once you think about it, the moment you get curious about this, you will know, I will tell you the story of what Indian Air Force was doing in the intervening days. What they were doing in the intervening days is what normally they would have liked to do before going out to attack Bahawalpur and Muridke. That is to carry out a suppression of enemy air defense. There are two terms that we must always remember, and that is something that Air Chief Marshal B.R. Chaudhary, who's our guest on Off the Cuff, and I will share a link with you. Please check it out. He explains it also. So SEAD and DEAD, suppression of enemy air defense and destruction of enemy air defense. Any air force, before it goes into battle, will carry out those operations to give itself a secure battlefield, a secure airspace, or a relatively secure airspace. That Indian Air Force was not able to do because of the limited rules of engagement, because the political direction was in the very beginning that we have to say we are not fighting Pakistani military. We are only attacking the terrorists. Like that's the reason if you first attacked Pakistani radar stations or missile units, that would mean you are declaring war on the Pakistani military. Don't do that. That's what they were not able to do. Now they took their time planning, and on the 7th itself, in fact on the 8th morning, it became very evident because the Pakistanis began reacting. We are seeing these pesky drones over some of our cities deep inside Pakistan. It took them also some time realizing what these drones were. These drones were two versions of an Israeli drone that India imported, not now, but a long time back. Harop and Harpy. Harpy came first. Harop is a version of Harpy. These two have some similarities, but they have slightly different functions. These two have some similarities, but they have slightly different functions. So if you see Harpy, and you can imagine, nobody has told me how many did we use or how many of which did we use. The Pakistanis said that they spotted about 20-25 of these drones, but it took them some time figuring out what these drones were doing, because they might have thought that these drones are like dud drones that they were sending out to figure out the gaps in our air defenses, etc., or also to pick up our frequencies. They only realized these drones packed a really damaging punch when one of them hit their big radar site and the HQ-9 launch site. HQ-9 radar, that's the HQ-9 missile. HQ-9 missile is a very potent missile. It's a Chinese reverse engineered improved version of the Russian S-300 that was hit in Lahore and obliterated. All of Lahore saw it and all of Lahore heard it because that happened in daytime. Once that happened, then the Pakistanis realized that this was a deadly SIAD and DIAD campaign, because these harpies were spread to critical places where Pakistanis had their missile stations and also their radars. For example, I'm reading the Pakistani list: Lahore, Attock, Gujranwala, Chakwal, Rawalpindi, Bahawalpur, right? These Harpy drones don't do anything else. Harpy drones are specialized only to attack radars. These have a 500-kilometer range. They are radar homing, passive radar homing. So if your radar is on, this one will come looking for you. If your radar is off, then this will be loiter around and ultimately self-destruct because it has no other function. So what happened? Pakistanis lost some radars and some HQ-9 batteries, and while Harpy was doing this, the other version, Herop, which is a longer range version, that's a 1,000-kilometer version. The difference between Harpy and Herop is that Herop can also bust radars, which it was doing, but one, it has a much longer range and much longer endurance, and much longer endurance. It is not autonomous. Harpy is autonomous. Once it goes there, you tell it generally where to go. Then it has to find radar signal, radar radiation somewhere to go and lock onto it and strike into it. Herop can be controlled by an operator remotely. Herop, an operator can manipulate. In fact, the chances are, I will not say it for sure because I don't know for sure, but from whatever pictures you've seen, you can see that on the first night of the targets that were hit in POK, these were terror launch pads in POK. If you see the pictures that were displayed by the army spokespersons, it looks like in some of those attacks, Herop drones were used. So the operator could see where this one is going. This is the launch pad. This is the house. Let it go and hit precisely this point so as to minimize collateral damage. On the 8th, these were also used in the SIAD, in the SIAD or DIAD operation. In the SIAD or DIAD operation, we've seen evidence of some DIAD. Lahore, for example, probably Malir in Karachi, probably one or other in Sindh, probably one or other in Punjab as well. But what happened to the Pakistanis? See this, if I can find this, I'll share it with you. Otherwise, over the next couple of days, I'll find it for you. The Pakistanis released a statement. It's an unsigned statement, a 2.5 line statement, and you can see the armed forces language, basically saying that these drones came in. We have now figured out that they were targeting our radars. So we have now stopped tracking them with our radars. We are trying to find them and shoot them down. What does it mean? What it means is that while a few radars may have been damaged or destroyed, a few HQ-9 batteries may have been attacked, at least one definitely was in Lahore, that forced the Pakistanis to switch off their radars. That is the classical SIAD, suppression of enemy air defense. And once that had happened and they had to worry about more of these monsters coming in, these are not cheap. These are not as cheap as quadcopters. These will be about $4 to $5 million each. But what is $4 to $5 million when just the fear of these? What is about 20 pieces or 30 pieces of a $4 to $5 million equipment, when one, it can write off a $100 billion, $200 billion HQ-9 battery, very expensive radars, but also it makes the adversary switch off their radars for several hours. And then your Air Force can go merrily into a rampaging mode. That's exactly what happened between the early hours of 9th and 10th. And through those hours on the 10th, when all these Pakistani air bases, weapon storages, command and control centers were hit. So that answers the question of what the Indian Air Force was doing for 2 days. They were not grounded. They were now preparing in a correct way, in a proper way, for a classical air dominance operation. What happened on the 6th and 7th night was not an air dominance operation. That was a punitive operation directed only at terror groups. And that's why Such an exercise was not possible until then. The general are CDS. We actually welcome transparency and see the 50-word edit that we wrote. We welcome this transparency. India has never ever hidden its losses or casualties. That is what gives India the military credibility. No Indian soldier, unfortunately, if a soldier dies, will go unsung because the name will appear on the National War Memorial, right? Body will go home for the last ride. So transparency is a strength. So good to be transparent. The only editing suggestion I would have given was that when you say tactical errors were made, maybe you could have said tactical limitations were there. Just the change of one word, but that's what we editors do. But for that, we have to see the copy first. And just these few drones also created the space and time for the Indian Air Force, the pilots and the aircraft to launch their weapons patiently with as much time as they needed without any interruption or threat either from the Pakistani Air Force in the air or even the ground-based missiles, because they had all gone to sleep. Once again, just these drones forced Pakistan's Air Force to be grounded while their entire country was under attack. And just these drones gave India's Air Force the fullest protection so they could launch their weapons patiently with a lot of time at their command with no interruption.